how Bacon's rebellion was a catalyst for creating race. Historically, before the 17th century, the legal and social concept of a unified white race simply did not exist in American colonies. People were categorized by religion, status, free, servant, or enslaved, and country of origin. The catalyst, Bacon's rebellion in 1676, was the exact tipping point that forced colonial elite to invent it. Why? Because the labor portion of the plantations or the fields burned Jamestown to the ground. In the 17th century, Virginia, the wealthy planter, which was the master class, relied heavily on labor force made up of two main groups: European indentured servants and enslaved Africans. At the time, these two groups lived, worked, and suffered alongside one another. They intermarried, socialized, and shared the same miserable living conditions under the exploitation of the wealthy elite. In 1676, a populist named Nathaniel Bacon tapped into the frustrations of the frontier settlers and organized an armed uprising. While Bacon had his own political motives, the rebellion quickly grew into something that absolutely terrified the colonial ruling class: a unified, multiracial class reunion. No, it wasn't a reunion. It was a rebellion. Black enslaved people, black free laborers, and poor European indentured servants fought side by side. They marched on the colonial capital, drove out the governor, and burned Jamestown to the ground. The elite nightmare. The rebellion proved that poor Europeans and enslaved Africans recognized that they had more in common with each other, their class, than they did with the wealthy landowners at the top. The color line was completely secondary to economic solidarity. The solution was manufacturing race, whiteness. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the wealthy planters realized that they could never let a multiracial alliance happen again. If the poor majority united by class, the wealthy minority would lose their power and fortunes. To shatter this solidarity, the elite systematically drove a wedge between poor Europeans and black workers. They did this by inventing legal privileges tied exclusively to skin color, effectively creating the concept of the white race. This strategy was codified into law 29 years later. The Virginia Codes of 1705 legally cemented the new racial hierarchy. The laws embedded explicit differences based purely on ancestry and skin tone. For white laborers, the poor Europeans were given new legal rights. They could no longer be physically whipped by their masters without a judge's order. They were given a small amount of cash, land, or grain when their indentured contracts ended. Crucially, they were permitted to police and supervise black laborers. For black laborers, Africans were permanently stripped of rights. Slavery was made a hereditary condition passed down through the mother. Black people, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved, were forbidden from owning weapons, lifting a hand against a white person, or testifying in court against a white person. See, the psychological wage of the color line was giving poor Europeans a tiny amount of legal standing and social status. The ruling elite bought their loyalty. Now, this is referred to as psychological wage. Two people spoke on it, Du Bois and Roediger, I believe. But poor Europeans were still economically exploited, underpaid, and landless, but they were given a badge of status. They were told, you may be poor, but at least you are white, which means you are better than the people at the bottom. In exchange for this psychological boost, poor Europeans agreed to defend their very plantation system that kept them poor, acting as slave patrols and enforcing new racial order. Something like what we have right now with the government and the elections and the electing of people in the executive branch, in the judicial branch, and let's not call it a legislature, those other people. Now, let's look at the elasticity of whiteness, which means it was used in many ways whenever it was profitable for the master. Who counted as white shifted throughout American history based on political and economical needs. The Irish arrived in the mid-1800s, fleeing starvation, dehumanization, and political cartoons as ape-like white Negroes. Path to whiteness gained acceptance by taking jobs in law enforcement and explicitly distancing themselves from black Americans. The Italians, in large numbers in the late 1900s, faced severe segregation in the South. In 1891, 11 Italians were lynched in New Orleans, and the event that birthed Columbus Day as a federal concession, assimilated over decades through political alignment and integration into broader European American workforce. Eastern Europeans, early 20th century American eugenics, Madison Grant classified them as racially inferior to Anglo-Saxons. They were targeted by the Immigration Act of 1924 to block their entry, but gradually absorbed into the white category after the World War II as U.S. shifted its focus to a broader Caucasian versus black binary. Now, ultimately, the history of the concept reveals that race is not a biological reality, because you're talking about pink to dark brown people, but a political tool. It was constructed in the ashes of Jamestown to break a cross-racial labor alliance, and it has been reshaped ever since to maintain political and economic power structures. This is intellectual food for people who are very smart but lazy about research. And that goes for all. But we weren't taught this in school. So in order to really find the truth, you have to do your research. Thanks, Shib, S-H-I-B.